Welcome, everyone. This is the EA Zoom meeting, and my name is Michelle Dench. I'm an astrologer. Um, this talk is on Pluto in Aquarius and Venus retrograde, and I'm calling it Love Evolution because the time that we are in now is a revolution of change, and ultimately this evolutionary impulse that we have, as Jeffrey Wolf Green, speaks about the soul, and the desire of the soul is ultimately to return to love. So as we are preparing for the transit of Pluto into Aquarius, and later this year for the nodal square of the nodes to Pluto in Capricorn, this is also happening while Venus is in relationship to these transits. So she is going to have a big part in the evolution of our souls, and thus love evolution is what we're here to do. So thank you so much for being here with me as we explore this. There is a preparatory energy to this particular time right now as Pluto is in its shadow degrees. And the actual transit of Pluto into Aquarius happens on March 23rd, 2023. So that is roughly about a month from the time of this recording. And Pluto's energy is already moving towards that 0-degree Aquarius entry point. We've already seen Mercury cross that 0-degree point, Venus cross that 0-degree point. So there's an initiation which is already underway. And I'm calling this an initiation of humanity into the death rebirth process over the next 20 years, but very similar to a total overhaul of the life as we know it. It begins with the seed, and that seed is really being born in the next 9 months. We look at the birth cycle, the life cycle of a baby. It begins before even conception has happened. The seed of that child lives in its parents, and then when the two people come together, that seed becomes one, and that baby takes 9 months in the womb to gestate. So in a sense, humanity is at a particular stage where we are already undergoing so much of that critical transformation in our own lives. 2019, 2020, 2021, and even much of this year thus far, 2022 into 2023, has been that sort of preparation point for that seed, for that conception of a new earth, of a new humanity, of a new way of human beings existing. And even the nodal cycle that we're in of Taurus Scorpio has been a preparation of that, because we're working with the fixed axis. And with the fixed signs, they are deeply steeped in the archetypal wisdom of the seasons that they represent, right? Heavy, heavy winter, heavy, heavy summer, heavy spring, and heavy fall. The cardinal axis initiates us into change, but the fixed axis is where the roots of that change begins. And so in a way, we're both in a transition of change that has so much to do with the fixed element being broken apart, being changed. That is the roots of our life, our emotional, physical, financial security, our self in relationship to self and other. And then we'll be moving in as Pluto goes back and forth on that Capricorn axis, back and forth between the edge of Aquarius and the end of Capricorn. We're going to be moving back to the cardinal axis, right? The nodes of the moon are going to move backwards into Aries and Libra and move into a square of Pluto in Capricorn. And that in and of itself initiates us on the level of masculine, feminine, family, mother, father, right? These are initiations of archetypes that form the foundation of our core orientation, right? Not to say that but all things are sort of formed on that cardinal axis. And as we're working with the fixed axis and the cardinal axis, we can know that everything that has fundamentally shaped our life, our world, our viewpoints, our relationships, our family systems is being initiated into a process of change. Generationally, we are going to be giving birth to a generation of human beings that are coming into probably one of the most cataclysmic changes of our lifetime. And if we look back at when was the last time Pluto was entering Aquarius, it was in the early part of the 1700s. 1777 is one very critical year of that entry point when the American Revolution and the French Revolution were when America was just emerging as a country, a newly born and formed country. There was huge upheaval in the world as people knew it, right? There was war, and there was death, and there was sickness, and there was change, and there was transformation that was ultimately giving way for humanity to step into a different way of living. And at that time, many of the roots of some of the cultural connotations that we see as our lives today, right? The patriarchy was really strengthened in that time because a lot of the colonization of the United States in particular shaped the world that ultimately formed in those next 248 years. And a part of what we're facing as a civilization today, as a people today, is the deconstruction of that colonial mindset, the deconstruction of the nuclear family system, of the world that gave way to such a fixed reality that we live in today. And as we're looking at political systems, economic systems, relational systems, food systems, right? All the places where we have developed a sense of reliance and security, these things are the very things that are being challenged in our current time. War and peace are challenges of our current time. Economic insecurity are challenges of our current time. And we've created a system based on a sort of capitalist framework that was born out of that last transit of Pluto into Aquarius. And so now we're at a point in humanity's history where that same system that has developed and become the system that we rely upon today is undergoing its own shift. And we can personalize all of this into our individual lives. And the presence of Venus in particular, and the presence of Mars and Aquarius, Venus, Mars, and Mercury, I think are good indicators of how this particular transit will begin to affect our individual lives. So, for those who have been living in a particular way, we can know that it's not the same as it was even a few years ago, right? Everything has changed. And with everything changing, we're still adjusting to those changes. So much of what we see in these cycles, at least from what I've experienced, is that the consistent retrograde cycle of Pluto brings a deeper and more intense evolutionary push for humanity. And what I'm hoping to cover in today's talk is really to integrate that push that Pluto is bringing with the relationship to Venus in particular, because she's leading in this transformation as you know, as a primary indicator. She's kind of saying, okay, and this started even months ago when Venus went into Capricorn. She conjoined with Pluto back in 2021. And then she repeated the same conjunction again at the end of 2022. And she sort of initiated us in that final cycle with Pluto. And then if we're following her transits, when Pluto moves into Aquarius, she's just past her conjunction to the North Node, right? So she's completing a further step, saying, okay, I'm going to lead the way here. What are we working on with this first Pluto ingress? We're working with Pluto entering Aquarius and the moon squaring Pluto right as that entry point happens, right? So the moon being ruled by Venus in Taurus speaks to the growth that we're really required to do at this point in our own evolutionary cycle, right? Taurus, self-trust, self-reliance. Taurus, embodiment, the strength of our connection to the earth, our physical strength, need for time and connection to ourselves in order to undergo a deep transformation. If we think about the image of a butterfly, the caterpillar walks on leaves and ground and earth. It is very much a earthbound being, and it starts its cocoon process interwoven to a tree, right, or to a leaf. It's close, it goes into its little cocoon. And so here we have just that first initiation of the cocoon saying, all right, we're being invited into a new fixed reality. This is a coming of a closing of a particular cycle that we've been undergoing for a long time, right? This is not new changes necessarily, as like the undercurrent of evolution has been pushing us upwards for such an incredible period of time. Anyone who undergoes a period like a dark night of the soul, right, knows that that process, that darkness, that cocoon time, it can last for months or years or even just a short period of time, but it's a complete undoing that happens in that time period. And in that complete undoing, there's a disentangling from the world that happens. There is a sense of the soul connecting to a reality that is beyond what it has been in. It's leaving behind or shedding forms of security, forms of emotional security, physical security, financial security. A lot of what can happen in the dark night of a soul can be a disillusionment process, right? This is the Neptune piece of this transformation. And all soul growth doesn't happen singularly from the Pluto perspective. I hold it from the whole perspective, the whole being, the whole soul perspective. So we're including all of the chart in this revolution, this undergoing, this undoing that's happening. And if we look at this, Mars is at the last degree of Gemini in conjunct to Pluto. That to me speaks to a crisis of our will in the way that we have been, facing all of this stuff at the end of Capricorn, facing all of this stuff relative to our emotional security, physical security relative to the nodes of the moon. But until our mind makes a change, until our will and our core impulses are aligned with evolution, right? Cooperating with evolution, until that moment happens, most of what we're experiencing is some level of struggle, some level of suffering, and or a mental pattern of flip-flopping back and forth between the desire to cooperate with evolution and the desire or the resistance to that desire, right? Or the resistance to what is arising. And so this particular ingress, I think, is really a critical mass in terms of our thinking, in terms of how we are choosing to lead and initiate ourselves into that death rebirth process. It's akin to the caterpillar really having a final thought as a caterpillar and saying, oh, that's it. I guess I'm no more. Like, I'm going to give up caterpillar ways, caterpillar thinking, and I'm not really sure what I'm going to do next, but I can't do this anymore, right? And maybe there's a moment in the dark night of the soul experience where we finally meet that resistance that wants to give way to something greater. And there's a real surrendering to a new way of thinking. And what often happens in those moments is that we're liberated entirely from a construct that had been holding us at a certain stage and evolution in life. And with Venus there in Taurus, she's moving towards Uranus, right? The moon squaring that Pluto is initiating an emotional attunement to the growth that we have been, has been building under the surface for months. And yet, as that breaks into our mind, into our way of thinking, there can be great peace, right? There can be almost like a deep exhale and then the first breath of an inhale. Shortly after this ingress, Mars moves into Cancer. And I think as we work as a people, as a collective, and as individuals to grow and change, and as we each face in our own lives the sort of critical mass that is moving us forward, then there will be a period of more emotional integration, a period of needing to get under the surface of the emotions that have been suppressed during this particular time period that we're in. And as we move towards the nodal axis, going from, right now being ruled by Venus in Taurus and Pluto ruling Scorpio, we're working with this very deep transformation. This is why I think Venus's relationship to Pluto in the coming year is probably one of the most important relationships. And I would give Mars that sort of second place to that, because the Mars work happened especially at the end of the year relative to the Mars retrograde that we had simultaneous to the Mercury retrograde. And you can see from this chart, Mars and Mercury are still maintaining that relationship. So the relationship between our desire nature, our instinctual desire nature, and the impulse with our thinking is still very deeply connected. As Mars moves into Cancer, then the shift becomes more to our feeling body relative to our thoughts. And I think that will bring a different period of integration during these first few months where Pluto is in Aquarius, right? We're going to be building, almost as if building new neural pathways, towards the future that are only a taste, just a beginning. This is why I think of the transits of Mercury and Venus as sort of the leading edge of that. We might already have some indication of this in our own lives, that there are ways of our relating to our physical and emotional security, to community and friendships, to groups of people, to our thoughts, to our physical health and our creative self-expression, right? All of the areas of our life that are sort of the cogs of who we are right now. If we were to think of them as 4 sectors of the life experience, right? Love and intimacy, home and foundations, our livelihood, our purpose or our activation, and then our well-being, our physical well-being, right? If we think of those making up the 4 legs of our life, that stool is about to get readjusted, right? That all of the places where that may have been out of balance or incongruent with desires that we have, right? Incongruent on the most fundamental level with soul level desires, right? I think of the bottom line as it's taught in evolutionary astrology of the soul returning to source, right? To know itself as love, to know itself as connected with the source of all life. Well, if the fixed axis and the cardinal axis are representative of that 4 legs of the source of all life, then we can see from this transit and from the coming transits of 2023 that is what's evolving, right? Move on here to talk a little bit about the process of that evolution. So with the Pluto ingress, we have the instinctual new frontier, right? But in order to fully arrive in any new stage of evolution, at some point, any part of ourselves that's still operating on an old system is going to have to go back, right? So what happens in this particular transit in 2023 is that we have a back and forth that starts now essentially and goes all the way until November 19th of 2024. So this year, and in fact, the next 9 months from March 23rd, 2023 until January 21st, 2024 are the first birth of the Pluto in Aquarius life. The second birth will happen later on in 2024. And then the final evolved step where we're fully in Pluto and Aquarius for the remainder of the next 20 years will happen November 19th, 2024 until 2044. So we have this sort of initial impulse, right? The seed of the new humanity is essentially existing in 2 people right now, right? In the fixed axis, in Taurus and Scorpio. And it's from an evolutionary perspective, growing in its strength. And then what will come in the next few months is that Pluto enters Aquarius and that fixed axis becomes really alive. And I actually want to share the transits with you just for some thought, just if we were looking at this This is this month, and I'll move forward month by month. So Pluto enters Aquarius March 23rd, 2023. And we have this again, first square of the moon. And the square to the nodal axis is a, 4-degree orb at this point. So we're still working with this fixed axis. It's not as strong maybe as it will be, but it's already initiating us through the lunar lens and through that conjunction to the nodes, right? This is an initiation into a change in our physical environment, our financial environment, our emotional security, our intimacy, our self, other, right? This is this very powerful axis of the fixed signs. And then we continue the next month, April. Venus has already entered Gemini, and Mercury is retrograde with Uranus. So I think this will bring, especially as Mercury moves into the shadow degrees, this will bring more information and integration. And you can see that the sun is with the North Node. So there's an actualization of the sense of self and purpose relative to that which has already been growing, right? The desire for us to grow and evolve it's latent. It's existing in all of humanity, whether we're aware of it or not. The impulse to thrive as human beings is existing, whether we're suppressing or denying something that needs to change, or whether we're actually cooperating with what needs to change in our life. Either way, the impulse is still there, right? The impulse for evolution is always existing within us, no matter what. And then we move, and Mercury gets to the end of its retrograde, stations direct, and Pluto stations retrograde. At this point, Venus is moving through the sign of Cancer towards Mars, and Mars is opposite Pluto. So their relationship is very important. Especially last year, I did an entire class series on the relationship of Venus and Mars together. This year, I'm doing a class series on the relationship of Pluto and Venus together, because I actually think that their interrelationship is more deeply connected this year. Like Venus leads the way. She led at the end of the year in her conjunction in Capricorn. She's leading the ingress of Pluto into Aquarius with her conjunction to the North Node. She's leading the way in a way, because by the time Pluto gets back into Capricorn, she is pretty much gone through her opposition to him and is getting ready to be stationing retrograde. Now, she and Mars are together at this point in June, and then they'll be moving further away from one another as Mars enters Virgo and Venus goes retrograde. So I think of the journey with Pluto as being deeply influenced by Venus's relationship to Pluto, Venus's relationship to the nodes, and Venus's relationship to Mars as well, right? And what happens in terms of the masculine and the feminine and the mother and the father axis, right? If these are the core identities that have shaped our world, right? Mother, father, male, female, and we're moving into a new age, a new era of relationship, a new age of gender identity expression, a new age relative to our homes and our families and our government and our orientation to our health and to our well-being and to life on this planet as we know it, then those constructs, those particular evolutionary constructs, are going to be undergoing a process of change, especially the primary constructs. And all of these things live inside of us, from no matter what our external or internal orientation is towards gender identity or towards sexual identity, towards relationships or family. No matter how we choose to live our life, the evolutionary draw to, based on what has been in the past, will be undergoing one of the most profound internal shifts, right? The way we see ourselves, the way we love ourselves, the way that we communicate, the way that we relate to other people, the way that we work, how we make money, how we eat, how we tend to children, how we treat, you know, the systems of our life, right? Aquarius is new thought systems. Leo is creative self-expression, children, raising children in a way that is different than the way that we've raised them before, right? And the children that are born into this time will be actually calling for us. They will already have the seed of this evolutionary impulse to change deep inside of them, right? Because it all lives inside of us. And when we find, this movement starts to happen, as we get into the summertime this year, things begin to slow down, right? The deepening of the internal shifts begin to happen. And this is the point at which Pluto really begins to square the nodal axis. So we have a retrograde Pluto at 29 degrees Capricorn, and we have the nodes which have now shifted from Taurus and Scorpio into Aries and Libra. And another reason why I feel that Venus is such a critical part of this evolutionary journey is because, from the perspective of EA, when we have a planet squaring the nodal axis, right, this is where the skip step happens. And the resolution node in this case has been the south node in Scorpio, will be the south node in Libra. So the shift happens as this square to the nodal axis begins to tighten. The resolution node is ruled by Venus, retrograde in Leo, right? So the sense of our releasing past patterns in relationship to others, releasing patterns of codependency, of relational communication patterns that have been built on a family system of oppression and suppression, denial of the feminine, denial of aspects of self, denial of the emotions, right? The Pluto polarity point at this time is 29 degrees Cancer, right? That's a critical degree relative to the mother. It's ruled by the moon. And we saw when Pluto first ingressed into Aquarius, the moon was there with the north node, indicating, with her being ruled by Venus, how important it is that the integration of the feminine, that the healing of the feminine in particular, the healing of the way we love, nurture, nourish, care, and protect for ourselves, regardless of our gender, male nor female or any other gender expression. We all have a desire for love, for connection. We all have a desire to be nourished, cared for, and protected. We all have needs, relational needs, right? And we all have a desire for self-actualization, right? Purpose, instinct, Mars, to do something with our lives that's in service to life itself. So as this square becomes even more exact during the middle part of July, and Venus stations retrograde, I can see how, from a soul perspective, there will be a deep, deep push to go back into that original instinctual, patterned way of being in relationship and deconstruct it. All of the patterns from family patterns, historical patterns, relational patterns, where the soul has suppressed or denied any part of itself and not allowed itself to be what it is, right? Any layers of identity that have been conditioned based on that sort of early patriarchal conditioning will be pushed up to the surface. And the intensification of this all points to what? Our desire to create new life, to create a new way of living and loving and understanding one another, right? And then here the sun moves through the opposition to Pluto, right? And that, I think, will mark a critical turning point. This year is almost, it's sort of like, well, we can think of the 3 stages of the caterpillar, right? Caterpillar, we were in caterpillar season at the beginning of the year. We were pretty fully living as caterpillars. Then March initiates cocoon into transforming, changing, transmuting. There's all this new energy coming in, right? But then there's soup, basically. And this is kind of the soup stage. And the soup is where you're really no longer able to distinguish. One of my students called it, she asked me in one of my classes the other day, how do I trust the process of being in the goo? This is kind of the goo. And, my answer is really that we are cultivating a sense of faith and trust in a greater evolutionary process that is both based on direct experience, right? We can look at our lives and look at the deep periods of transformation or changes and say, okay, I made it through that. If you can look at any kind of, and then there's some element of developing faith that comes from the knowing that any evolutionary shift that we're going to come through is only going to bring us more in touch with who we are becoming, who we desire to be, right? The bottom line of the soul is a desire to become love, a desire to return to source. And so if we can trust that anything that's being stripped away, anything, while however painful it might feel in the moment, is only bringing us more close to the truth of who we are, that's how to trust the goo, right? And the goo is often a process where we can't yet see what is happening or who we are or who we're becoming. But we can sense that we're not who we were, that we're not as identified with the past as we were. And this is a big period of time where I can see the value of having a lot of space in our lives for rest and integration. And the moon here, at this same time that this square is now with the South Node. So interestingly, we began the ingress with the moon on the North Node, and we have the regress and the square with the moon on the South Node, meaning that a lot of what is being shed is meant to be shed, right? It's meant to give way so that we can actually be initiated into a new way of living. Then later on, the following month, right, Venus is still retrograde, Mercury stations retrograde, Pluto's getting back kind of closer to the end of its shadow degrees. The retrograde degrees for Pluto are 27 to 0 Aquarius. So that's sort of the middle part of this retrograde season. This particular summertime is one of the most intense retrogrades that I've ever seen. By August 29th, all planets are retrograde except for Jupiter. And by September 4th, Jupiter is stationed retrograde. And the only shift happens in September. Venus stations direct and Mercury stations direct. But then by then we have Uranus retrograde, Jupiter, Chiron, Neptune, Saturn, Pluto, and pretty much Mars is the only one who's not having a retrograde this year because its retrograde is already over. So it's an intense period of accelerated growth, right? The retrograde archetype in and of itself accelerates the soul's growth. It's not like things are slowing down during that time. And then we get back to direct Pluto in October. And as Pluto moves direct, it moves through all of the degrees that it had before. Now the nodes get to a point where we're starting to be further away from that square, and Venus ends this year, November into December, crossing the South Node and going through Scorpio. I think that'll be kind of this final integration of all the Venus work from this year. And we end the year with Pluto at 29 degrees, right? So by January of 2024, we're back at 0 degrees, Aquarius. So this is a pretty powerful shift that happens. And the third part of the year is this final direct phase that I just described, from when Venus crosses the South Node into the 23rd of January. That is that sort of part 3. I think as Pluto gets back into Aquarius, we will be in a state and in a place of having undergone such a powerful evolutionary shift that much of life as we know it won't be the same. And the good news about that is that when Venus and Mars both get into Capricorn, they're actually going to come together, I think, when they get into Aquarius, right here, the following month, February 23rd. So this is a year from now when Venus and Mars come together. So in part, it's like the love evolution of this particular phase. Last year, it would have been very much about Venus and Mars together. And this year, it's very much about Venus and Pluto together until the end, where they all come together, right? So the integration comes full circle. It's not as though Mars and the Mars work is not as much a part of the year ahead. The evolution of our desires and our drive is deeply linked with Mars to Pluto. But from the perspective of what we're actually having to shed and release, so much of what we're having to shed has to do with shedding aspects of the feminine, aspects of suppression of our desires, our emotions, of the softer parts of us that have ultimately had to form mechanisms to cope living in a world that is not designed to nurture and protect and care for life, right? When we live in a world that has been dominating life and destroying life and ultimately challenging us, pushing us to the edge of evolution. The number of species that have died in this evolutionary cycle, the number of extinctions of plant and animal life over the last 248 years, the amount of even in simplest terms to our daily life, the rise in housing prices and the cost of living and the rise in sickness and illness that's sort of treated by the pharmaceutical industry, and the rise of government that has not provided the people with what they've actually needed to thrive, right? We're moving from survival, Capricorn resilience, into a more people-oriented way of living that requires us to come together in order to create a new world, right? It requires us to know our interdependence, the masculine and the feminine, the mother and the father, the community and the individual. We have to ultimately know our interdependence in order to heal issues of addiction, issues of oppression, issues of destruction, issues of harm against ourselves and others that have come through war, not peace, right? That have come through domination, not mothering, not nurturing, not caring. And so as those systems that have really created the industrial age and created the age of capitalism have to be deconstructed, as we have to face the different thought systems that have challenged us to see ourselves as separate and as alone and afraid and, you know, needing to be self-reliant. That's the word. There's the Taurus word, self-reliant. Changing that into interdependence model, into a self-reliance that actually is supported reliance, right? Supported reliance is different than self-reliance. It's self-reliance thinks of itself as I'm alone here. And so I have to be able to count on myself because I can't count on anyone else. And interdependence sees myself as connected here and reliant upon supporting the mutual support of another in order for the mutual well-being of another, right? These are shifts in mindsets. It's a matter of like, do we see ourselves as kin? Do we see ourselves as family? And how do we live our life in relationship to all of those who are around us? Each of us live within a community and a framework and a family system and a political system that ultimately will have to change as a part of this evolutionary impulse. So by the time we get into this time next year, much of the work that we've been working towards is this internal shift, right? Evolution happens from within. It happens through this nodal square into a time where we will be challenged to face the patterns of the past, the conditioning of the past, making a cardinal completion, right? It's the end of a complete cycle of Pluto in Capricorn. It's the end of a cycle of oppression and depression and suppression, and the beginning of a cycle where we're invited to really transform our lives through our feelings, through our sense of relationship to something that is beyond us, something that is new and different. Through the Venus retrograde, we'll see some of the most intense power points of this will happen around July 22nd, when the sun is in Cancer, squaring the nodal axis, and also August 12th, when Juno is opposite Pluto, squaring the nodes. September 9th is another critical day post the retrograde, when Juno and Venus will conjunct. right? This is a transformation to love and to relationship, to committed partnership, to that which we are committing ourselves to nurture and care for and protect, right? What are we here to care for? What are we here to tend to? The shadow degrees of the Venus retrograde span from June 19th until September 6th. So that is kind of the most intense period. And you could see when I went through the transits, it gets progressively more intensified in that every area of our life, every area of the world will on some level, it's like kind of the image that comes to mind is a ball of clay that has many, many colors, that as you start to, massage the clay together, instead of it being many colors, it becomes one sort of gray blob. Like that's the transformation. Many of these things in our life that are suffering or we're struggling with right now might seem like one piece. And as we go through this evolutionary journey, it's really going to come more and more together, that all of who we are and what we are and life as we know it has to change in order for there to be a rebirth of ourselves and our life. And, the path forward through this movement of Pluto is really doing the work of the soul work. This is why I feel so deeply drawn to study EA, especially the teachings of Jeffrey Wolf Green, the idea that we are one soul, one, all created from the same source, all returning to that same source. And each individual soul, as it is working through its life and its karma and its story, more and more as I work with clients, I see how the reflection of the soul is all the same. It's all the same work. It's the core healing of that disconnect in our memory between who we are as love and who we see ourselves to be and how we see the world to be. And a lot of this is healing very core dynamics relative to family relationships. When I look at the chart, I see imprints of early trauma, and a lot of that trauma becomes the foundation. There was something I was reading the other day about how the imprint of a child is formed in the first 1,000 days. And I imagine if you were to look at the transits of your life in the first 1,000 days of your life, it would pretty clearly lay out a story of evolution that continues to be reflected in your life today. As a soul, we're constantly evolving and growing around these very foundational patterns. So as we work to transform where those patterns have developed stories about ourself, our life, where it's created, where the soul has created crisis or has had to work to overcome blocks to loving, blocks to connection, right? The more we each on our own individual soul path commit to that work, commit to sort of peeling back the layers of conditioning that have blocked our own awareness of who we truly are, the more we will become expressions of that love of source, expressions of these beautiful and unique souls. And then we can come together and see how interconnected our lives very much are, and how we're all on the same planet. We're all breathing the same earth and stardust and air, and we all are warmed by the same sun, right? And that perspective begins to create a sense of, oh, this is my kin, this is my soul family, and these are the people that I am meant to grow with and evolve with. And ultimately, that makes our planet a more beautiful place to live. So that is my transmission on this transit of Pluto into Aquarius. If you want to learn more about the work that I do, you can go to astrologywithmichelle.com. On the soul work page, I detail a lot of how I work with students on a monthly basis. I offer transmissions on the transits every month and a new moon ceremony. And I have a core class series that is devoted to this Pluto into Aquarius journey called Soul Evolution. Later this year in April, we will begin the love evolution phase of it, which is completely dedicated to transforming the heart of the feminine, really coming back to living in an open-hearted, love-centered way that is grounded in being embodied and doing our own work and having that right relationship to the counterpart, the masculine, the external world, to our families of origin, to our history, and to our ancestry, and all of the healing work that is entailed in doing that as a soul here on this planet. So if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer any questions. Otherwise, we'll close for today.
Thank you, Michelle. That was lovely and enlightening.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. It was very lovely. Totally enjoyed it.
Thank you. All right.